Zoe had always believed in destiny. She'd been raised in a string of foster homes after losing her parents at a young age, moving from one family to the next, never quite feeling like she belonged anywhere. She had grown used to the feeling of being an outsider, always watching others form connections she could never seem to make. The relationships in her life, whether with friends, roommates, or even boyfriends, felt temporary, as though they existed only in the moment, never with the promise of permanence. The idea of real love seemed like something out of a fairy tale, something that happened to other people. But then, one autumn afternoon, everything changed. It was a crisp Saturday, the kind where the sunlight bathed the streets of New York in a soft golden hue. Zoe had been wandering around the city with no particular destination in mind, her mind a jumble of thoughts. She had recently broken up with someone, a guy she had been seeing on and off for a few months, and she was still processing the aftermath. She had hoped the relationship would develop into something more, but it had never quite clicked. She knew it was over when she started to feel more like a roommate than a girlfriend. She needed some space, some time to herself, and, as always, the city had a way of soothing her restless soul. Her feet led her to a small, independent bookstore she had passed by many times but had never actually entered. She'd always loved books, their smell, their texture, the stories they held. On a whim, she decided to go inside, letting the comfort of the familiar, quiet atmosphere wrap around her like a warm blanket. The store was relatively empty, just a few scattered customers browsing, and the air was thick with the smell of old pages and coffee from the small cafe tucked in the corner. Zoe smiled as she wandered down the aisles, running her fingers over the spines of books she had never heard of, but felt inexplicably drawn to. That was when she first saw him. He was standing near the back of the store, his face buried in a book. There was something about him that made Zoe pause. It wasn't that he was overwhelmingly handsome, though he certainly had the kind of face you'd remember, but it was the way he carried himself. He had an aura of quiet confidence, an easy way of being that seemed natural. As she stood there, uncertain of whether she should continue exploring or take a closer look at the man who had caught her attention, he looked up. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither of them moved, as if the world around them had stopped. Zoe's breath caught in her throat, and she felt something stir inside her, a feeling she hadn't had in a long time. It was a spark, the kind you read about in novels but never really expect to experience. There was a familiarity in his gaze, though she didn't know him. Her heart skipped a beat. He smiled, an easy, warm smile, and for some reason, Zoe felt like she had known him her whole life. "Sorry, didn't mean to stare," he said, his voice low and smooth. "No, it's fine," Zoe replied, feeling a bit self-conscious. "I was just, I don't know, lost in thought, I guess." "I get that," he said. "It's the kind of place that makes you think." She nodded, glancing at the book he was holding. It was an old, leather-bound novel, something she had never seen before. "What's that?" "This?" he asked, glancing down at it. "It's a collection of short stories. I'm a sucker for old books, you know." Zoe laughed softly. "Yeah, me too. They just feel different." "I'm Daniel," he said, holding out his hand. "Zoe," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm but not too tight, and his touch lingered for just a moment longer than it should have. They stood there for a few moments, unsure of how to proceed. Neither of them seemed in a rush to walk away. Daniel broke the silence first, glancing around at the shelves. "You come here often?" he asked. "Not really," Zoe admitted. "I've passed by a few times but never went in. Something about the place, though, it feels cozy." "I know what you mean," Daniel said, glancing back at her. "It's one of those hidden gems, the kind of place you want to keep to yourself, but then again, you want to share it with someone." "I guess we're both here now," Zoe said, smiling. "Guess we're sharing it, in a way." And just like that, they both laughed. Genuinely, comfortably. It was as if they had known each other for years, as though this moment, this conversation, had been waiting to happen. After a few moments, Daniel offered to buy Zoe a coffee from the cafe, and she agreed, feeling like it was the natural next step. They sat by the window, sipping their drinks as they talked about everything and nothing. Books, life in the city, their favorite authors, and what it meant to truly feel at home. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and Zoe found herself drawn to Daniel in a way she couldn't explain. He had a way of listening, really listening, that made her feel heard in a way few people had ever done before. He was open, funny, and kind, but there was a depth to him, an intelligence and understanding of the world that made Zoe feel like she was talking to someone who saw her, truly saw her for who she was. Over the next few weeks, they saw each other again and again. What started as casual coffee dates turned into dinner outings, movie nights, and walks in the park. They shared their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets, and the connection between them grew stronger with each passing day. Zoe had never felt so understood, so at peace with someone. There was no pretense, no awkwardness. It was as if they had known each other for years, and for the first time in a long while, Zoe allowed herself to believe that love, real love, might actually be possible. It was clear to both of them that what they had was something special. They didn't rush into anything. Instead, they took their time, letting the relationship unfold naturally. But Zoe couldn't deny the way she felt when she was with Daniel. Safe, loved, like she had found the missing piece of herself. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. By the time the holidays rolled around, they were inseparable. Their conversations turned to the future, to a life together. Zoe started to imagine a world where she wasn't alone, where she had someone by her side to face whatever life threw her way. And in Daniel, she thought she had found that person. One cold evening in December, they were walking home from a dinner date when Daniel stopped in front of a small jewelry store. He turned to her, his eyes sparkling with something Zoe couldn't quite place. "Zoe," he said softly, taking her hands in his. "I know it's been only a few months, but I can't imagine my life without you. I don't want to." Zoe's heart skipped a beat, her pulse racing. She didn't know what to say. Her mind was spinning with thoughts, with emotions. She had never expected things to move so fast. But here she was, standing in front of him, feeling like this was it. The moment she had been waiting for her entire life. "Will you marry me?" Daniel asked, pulling out a small, velvet box from his pocket. Zoe's eyes welled up with tears. She felt an overwhelming wave of emotion wash over her. Joy, fear, love, excitement. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, hardly believing the words as they left her lips. "Yes, I will." In that moment, everything felt perfect. Zoe believed with all her heart that she had found her soulmate, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. Zoe's life, which had felt so beautifully arranged in its perfect moment, was about to be shattered beyond recognition. It began so simply, so innocently, and yet it would spiral into something she never could have imagined. What started as a casual decision, a decision that would, in hindsight, seem like one of the most significant choices of her life, soon took them both down a path of painful discovery. It started one late afternoon, just a few weeks after their engagement. Zoe had been feeling particularly reflective lately. The whirlwind of wedding planning, the excitement of blending lives, and the uncertainty of what the future might hold had all left her with moments of restless contemplation. For someone who had never known real family, the idea of creating her own was an alluring, almost intoxicating dream. She daydreamed about the children they might have, the life they could build together. Daniel felt like everything she had ever wanted. One evening, while sitting on the couch with Daniel sipping her usual glass of red wine, Zoe happened to browse through some articles on her phone. She stumbled upon a story about genetic testing becoming more mainstream, how people were learning fascinating details about their ancestry with just a simple swab. At first, she thought it was a frivolous idea, but then a thought struck her. A small, curious impulse. She had always wondered about her biological roots, never knowing much about her real parents or where she came from. Her foster family had never known the answers, and she'd always dismissed the questions. But now, with Daniel, this feeling of wanting to know more, to understand herself, seemed stronger than ever. "I'm thinking of doing a DNA test," she said to Daniel, almost offhandedly. "Maybe it would be interesting to learn more about my family background. You know, where I really come from." Daniel, who had been scanning his tablet, looked up and gave a thoughtful nod. That's actually a good idea. I've been curious about my heritage too. It'd be interesting to see if we're related to any royal bloodlines or something. Zoe chuckled at the thought of Daniel having royal ancestors, though she liked the idea of them both embarking on this little journey of discovery together. Maybe we'll find out we're related to some great explorers or famous artists, she said. She didn't really believe it, but the idea made her smile. Within a week, they both sent off their DNA samples to one of the popular services, the excitement bubbling under the surface of their ordinary lives. Zoe forgot about the test as the days went on. Wedding plans consumed her, and life took its usual twists and turns. The anticipation of a future together, one she'd never had before, was more than enough to keep her mind occupied. Danielle and she spoke often about their dreams of a small home in the countryside, about raising children in a place that wasn't the overcrowded chaos of New York City. She saw herself with him for the long haul. She believed in it. Then, one morning, just a few days before Christmas, everything changed. The email came through as she sipped her coffee, trying to wake up and mentally prepare for the busy day ahead. It was from the DNA testing service. Zoe didn't think much of it at first. Her eyes glazed over the message until one sentence caught her eye. "Your results are ready." She clicked on the link and followed the prompts. Her heart began to race for no particular reason. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was excitement, but there was a strange feeling growing inside her, a sense of unease she couldn't quite explain. As the page loaded, the results came into view, broken down into a neat digital chart. But something about it didn't sit right with her. She scrolled down, scanning the ancestry information. There was her name, the usual list of her genetic origins, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, beneath it, a list of genetic matches. One match stood out above all the rest. Shared DNA. 99% match. Her pulse quickened. That wasn't possible. She looked closer, her breath catching in her throat. The name beside it was Daniel. For a long moment, Zoe's mind refused to process what her eyes were showing her. The results stared back at her coldly, not offering any comfort, not making sense. A 99% match? How could that be? There was no mistake, no glitch in the system. This was real. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, crashing into her chest and leaving her breathless. Her eyes blurred as she stared at the screen, unable to tear her gaze away. This had to be a mistake, a strange coincidence, some statistical anomaly. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. She thought about the test again, the thought they had both shared, innocently and without any expectation. They were supposed to learn about their ancestors, their genetic histories. Zoe had no idea where this was heading, but now, with the information in front of her, it seemed like everything had been tipped upside down. She had never considered the possibility that Daniel and she could be connected in such a way. He was her fiancé. He was the person she had envisioned spending the rest of her life with, raising children and growing old together. How could they possibly be related like this? It was unthinkable. Her heart pounded, a strange combination of panic and disbelief flooding her system. She quickly closed the email, as if hiding it from herself might make it go away. Her hands trembled, and she had to take a few steadying breaths before she could function again. But her thoughts spun in wild circles. She couldn't shake the image of the test results, the confirmation of something that seemed utterly impossible. They couldn't have been wrong. They couldn't. Without thinking, Zoe grabbed her phone and texted Daniel, her fingers shaking as she typed the words, "I need to talk to you, right now. It's important." Within minutes, he replied, "Of course, what's going on?" I need to tell you something," Zoe typed quickly, biting her lip. "It's about the DNA test. It's not what we thought." The moment the message sent, Zoe stood up, pacing around the small apartment. She had no idea how to even begin explaining what was happening. It felt surreal. Her world, everything she had come to trust, felt like it was crumbling beneath her. Her chest tightened as she tried to breathe normally, but the air felt too thick. The room seemed to close in around her. Daniel arrived within half an hour and Zoe met him at the door. His usual warm smile faltered when he saw her expression. "Zoe, what's wrong?" he asked, stepping inside. His face was concerned, his eyes searching hers. I... Daniel's eyebrows furrowed. And? Zoe swallowed hard. "It's us, Daniel. We're..." Before she could finish, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced down at it briefly, distracted for just a moment. When he looked back at her, his face drained of color. "What do you mean? What are you trying to say?" Zoe hesitated, her heart beating so loudly in her ears that she couldn't hear herself speak. But the words came out anyway, jagged and raw. We're related. The DNA test says you're my brother." Daniel's face went white, his eyes wide with disbelief. The world seemed to stop for both of them in that instant, as if time itself had been suspended. His jaw hung open, and Zoe's chest tightened painfully with the shock and fear she saw on his face. "What? No, that's not possible. It has to be a mistake," Daniel stammered, taking a step back. "I mean, we've been together for months. We've talked about marriage. This can't be happening." I thought it was a mistake too," Zoe said softly, her voice cracking. "But the results, Daniel, they're clear. We share 99% of our DNA. It's not a glitch. It's real." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, unbearable and infinite. Neither of them knew what to say next. And in that moment, Zoe's life, what she thought was her life, began to unravel in a way she never could have prepared for. The silence in Zoe's apartment was thick and suffocating. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her, pressing down on her chest with a weight she couldn't bear. The air was still, too still. She looked at Daniel, who stood in front of her, his eyes wide with disbelief, his mouth moving as though he wanted to say something, but no words came out. His hands were shaking, and his face had gone an ashen shade of white. Zoe couldn't blame him. She didn't know what to say either. Her head was spinning, and her thoughts were a jumbled mess of confusion and fear. How could this be real? How could this be happening to them? She had thought the worst thing that could happen in their relationship was something small. A misunderstanding, maybe an argument about something trivial. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. The sound of Daniel's breathing was the only thing that broke the silence, shallow and rapid, as if he were struggling to find air in a room that was suffocating them both. Zoe could feel the panic rising in her own chest, her heart beating faster than it should. She had never felt so lost, so helpless. For the first time in her life, she realized she had no idea what to do. "Zoe, this can't be true," Daniel said finally, his voice low and strained. There's no way this is possible. We've been together for months. I've been planning to marry you. How could we be related?" Zoe swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I don't know," she whispered, "but the DNA test says it's true. We're siblings, Daniel. You're my brother." Daniel shook his head, as if trying to deny it. He took a step back, hands running through his hair in frustration. "This is insane. This is some kind of mistake. It has to be." "I don't think it is," Zoe said, her voice trembling. "I don't want it to be true either, Daniel, but everything in those results tells me that it is." The two of them stood there, unable to move, unable to speak for a moment, each of them processing the bombshell that had been dropped on their lives. Zoe's mind raced through every possible explanation, but she couldn't find one that made sense. How had this happened? How had they never known? What did this mean for their future? She thought about their relationship, their love, the way it had blossomed so quickly. She thought about their shared hopes, the dreams they had whispered to each other late at night as they lay in bed together. She had thought they were building something real, something lasting, but now everything felt like a lie. "We need to figure this out," Daniel said, his voice shaky but determined. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen. We need answers, Zoe." Zoe nodded. "I agree, but I don't even know where to start. This changes everything. I need to know why this happened. I need to understand." "We will," Daniel said, his voice firmer now. "We'll find out what happened. We'll get to the bottom of this. We deserve to know." Zoe's thoughts turned to her own past, to the years she had spent in foster care, separated from her biological family. She had been so young when she was taken from her parents, too young to remember them clearly. She had been told that her parents had died in a car accident, that there was no family left to take care of her. She had spent years in the system, moving from one foster home to another, never staying in one place for long. She had learned to rely on herself, to survive on her own. But there had always been a part of her that wondered, a part of her that wanted to know the truth about where she came from. When she had met Daniel, she had thought that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place to belong. He had been her rock, her anchor in a world that had always felt uncertain. But now the rug had been ripped out from under her. It felt as though the very foundation of her life had been shattered. "I was adopted," Zoe said softly, breaking the silence between them. "I don't remember anything about my biological parents. I don't even know if they were good people or if they loved me. I never had the chance to know them." Daniel turned to face her, his eyes filled with sympathy and confusion. "Zoe, I had no idea. Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "I guess I never really thought about it. I didn't want to think about it. It's been easier to just move on, to focus on the life I have now. But now? This changes everything." Daniel stepped toward her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out. We'll find out the truth. I promise." Zoe nodded, but she wasn't sure if she could believe him. How could they possibly fix this? How could they undo what had already been done? "Maybe we should talk to your parents," Zoe suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "They might know something. Maybe they can help us figure out what happened." Daniel hesitated, his hand still resting on her shoulder. "I don't know. I don't know if I'm ready to confront them about this. It's so big." "I get it," Zoe said quietly. "I feel the same way. But we can't just ignore it. We need to understand why this happened. If we don't, we'll never move forward. And we deserve to know the truth." Daniel sighed heavily, then nodded. "Okay. We'll talk to them. We'll find out what happened." But as Zoe lay in bed that night, the thought of confronting her past, of unearthing the hidden truths about her family, filled her with dread. What if it was something she wasn't ready to hear? What if the truth was worse than she could ever imagine? And what if, somehow, it tore them apart? The next morning, Zoe sat down at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. She had been doing some research, trying to find any clue that might explain how this could have happened. She scrolled through adoption forums, reading about other people's experiences, about the families that had been torn apart by hidden secrets and forgotten histories. She wanted answers, but more than anything, she wanted peace. She needed to know how this all fit together. That was when she found something that made her heart skip a beat. A story from a woman who had been adopted and later discovered she had a sibling she never knew existed. The woman described how her birth father had put her and her brother up for adoption, keeping them both a secret from each other. It was as if their father had intentionally kept them apart, hiding their existence from the other. Zoe's hands shook as she read the story. Was this what had happened to her and Daniel? Had their father known they were siblings but kept them separated? Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Zoe felt a wave of nausea sweep over her as the realization set in. Their father had to be the key. He was the only one who could answer their questions. And so, Zoe made a decision. She had to find him. She had to confront him, no matter how painful it might be. She couldn't move forward in her life until she knew the truth. She had to face her past, no matter what it held. The truth was waiting for her, but Zoe had no idea how it would change everything. Zoe woke up the next morning with a sinking feeling in her stomach, an unshakable knot that had formed overnight. The silence between her and Daniel felt heavy, like an invisible wall between them. She could hear him moving around the apartment, but neither of them spoke. The conversation they'd had the night before, if you could even call it that, had left a chasm between them. Neither of them knew what to say or how to move forward. What could they say? What could they do? The night had felt like it had lasted forever, but when Zoe finally managed to fall asleep, she had dreamt of her parents, the ones she'd never known. Her dreams were fragmented, hazy images of a time she could never remember. And when she woke up, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world she had known had crumbled away to nothing. Daniel hadn't slept either. She could see the dark circles under his eyes when he came out of the bedroom, and his posture was rigid, as if he were carrying a weight far too heavy for his frame. They exchanged glances but remained silent, each of them aware of the immense task that lay before them. They couldn't pretend this wasn't happening anymore. They couldn't hide from the truth. After a long silence, Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but determined. "We need to go to the adoption agency. We need to find out everything we can. It's the only way." Zoe nodded, unable to speak. She wasn't sure she was ready to hear whatever was coming, but the desire to know the truth was stronger than the fear. They had already come so far, and they owed it to themselves to understand what had happened, to figure out how they were connected. The adoption agency was located in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a place Zoe had never been. She had never felt the need to go there, never had the curiosity to dig deeper into her past. But now, it seemed like the only place that could provide answers. The small building was old, the kind of place that felt like it had seen decades of heartache and bureaucracy. As they stepped inside, a sense of unease settled over Zoe. The air inside felt stale, and the quietness was almost oppressive. They were greeted by a woman at the front desk, a middle-aged receptionist with kind eyes, though there was a certain hesitance in her demeanor as she looked at them. She seemed to know they were there for something serious. She gestured for them to sit. "I'm sorry, but I'll need you to fill out some forms before we can proceed," the woman said, her voice calm but formal. "What's the nature of your inquiry?" Zoe hesitated, unsure how to phrase it. She couldn't just blurt out that they had discovered they were siblings through a DNA test. It sounded absurd even to her own ears. "We're here to ask about my adoption," she said instead, her voice steady despite the racing thoughts in her mind. "I was adopted when I was young. I need to know more about my biological family." The receptionist nodded, taking down Zoe's information, then turned to Daniel. "And are you here for the same reason?" Daniel stiffened slightly, but nodded. "Yes," he said. "We believe we might be related, and we're trying to understand how." The receptionist blinked, clearly taken aback by the phrasing. She took a moment to process the words before typing something into the computer. "This will take a few minutes," she said quietly. "Please wait here." Zoe and Daniel sat in silence as the receptionist disappeared into a back room. Zoe's heart pounded in her chest, and every second that passed felt like a step closer to a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. Her mind was spinning. What if they were wrong? What if this was just a mistake, a misunderstanding? What if they were making everything worse by even bringing it up? But then, the door behind the receptionist opened, and a woman stepped into the room. She was older, maybe in her late 50s, with a no-nonsense demeanor. She looked at Zoe and Daniel as if she had seen this kind of situation before, though her expression softened when she realized how serious their inquiry was. "You wanted to learn more about your biological family," she said, addressing Zoe. "I understand you've had some recent discoveries?" Zoe nodded, suddenly feeling smaller under the woman's gaze. "Yes," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. We found out through a DNA test that we might be siblings. I don't know how it's possible, but I need to understand what happened." The woman's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Let me pull up your file," she said, motioning for them to follow her down a hallway into a small office. As Zoe sat down, the woman typed quickly on her computer. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was the clicking of keys. Finally, the woman stopped typing and turned to face them. "There's something unusual here," she said, her voice calm but matter-of-fact. "You were both adopted from the same family. It's a rare occurrence, but it does happen. It seems that your birth mother had 2 children, but for reasons we don't entirely understand, she was only able to keep one of you." Zoe's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced as the woman continued. "Your birth mother, Sophie Moore, had 2 children, a daughter and a son. You were both born within months of each other. The daughter was placed with one family and the son with another. But there was something about the situation that made it impossible for them to stay together. Sophie Moore's situation was complicated. She was very young when she had you both and struggled with addiction. It was clear she couldn't take care of both of you at the time. So you were separated. But it appears the adoption agencies didn't know about the second child." Daniel and Zoe exchanged stunned looks. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was their reality. "So you're saying," Daniel began, his voice barely a whisper, "we were siblings and we didn't even know?" The woman nodded. "That's right. I'm not sure how it happened that you never knew about each other, but it appears that there were some intentional efforts to keep your adoption records separate. Perhaps it was to protect your mother, or maybe it was just a failure in the system, but the fact is, you two were meant to be siblings all along." Zoe sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. It was as though her entire life had been a lie, built on an elaborate series of misunderstandings and decisions made by people who didn't know what they were doing. She felt an overwhelming sense of grief and loss. Everything she had known about herself, about her family, had been false. It was as if the ground beneath her was slipping away, and she was losing her grip on everything. We didn't even know we had a sibling," Zoe said softly, her voice trembling. "We grew up not knowing we had each other." "I'm sorry," the woman said gently. "But this is the truth. Your mother's situation was far from ideal. You two were separated for reasons beyond anyone's control, and now you've found each other. I can't imagine what this must be like." Daniel stood up, his face pale but determined. "We need to talk to her. We need to find Sophie." Zoe shook her head. "We don't even know where to begin. This is all too much." "I know," Daniel said quietly, "but we have to try." The woman gave them the information she had on Sophie Moore, including the name of a rehabilitation center where she had stayed years ago. It was a small lead, but it was something. With that, Zoe and Daniel left the agency, their minds still reeling. The drive back to their apartment was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. Zoe couldn't help but think about how her life had been shaped by the choices of others. She had lived in foster homes, always feeling like something was missing. Now, she realized that the missing piece was Daniel, her brother, the person she had been meant to find all along. When they arrived back at the apartment, Zoe turned to Daniel, her face pale. "We've found the truth, but what do we do now?" Daniel took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We take it one step at a time. We can't change the past, but we can control what happens next." Zoe nodded slowly. They didn't know where this journey would take them, but they knew one thing for sure. They had each other now. And maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild the life they had once dreamed of. Together.